there was an advert on the tube, say, go vegan. I had quite a strong reaction to this. I was like, well, yeah, obviously factory farming is terrible, but we need system reform, legislation, this kind of thing. Like, that's the answer, right? Deep down, I did think that probably there was something wrong with how I was behaving. And it was just a way to avoid me having to actually engage with this problem. And when I realized that, that sort of sent me on this journey. About 98% of the meat is from a factory farm. It feels like it's this kind of thing that is never going to go away. I think it's almost certain that system will be history. And I think our job is actually just to speed that up. By tackling this one issue, we're actually able to help both humans and non-humans on some of the biggest problems that we as a world are currently facing. So I think it's a very exciting challenge and a very exciting place to be working with.
Good afternoon, Tom. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Nice to be here.
Yeah, it's brilliant to be in touch. So Cameron King, who's a previous guest on, let me look it up, episode 89, put us in touch, and your work sounds fascinating. So it's great to get the chance to understand your own sort of philosophical journey and how you're putting that to practice now. And it's great also that you've listened to or watched a few episodes too. So you know this already, but I guess Sentientism is broadly a worldview project, and the podcast and YouTube is trying to move that forward by asking some of the deepest and most important philosophical questions. Questions like what's real, epistemological questions about how should we understand things and how can we work out what's true. And just as importantly, the deep questions of ethics, what matters and who should count in our moral consideration. And I have an obvious bias because of this sentientism worldview, which in simple terms is evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings in a sentence. So it suggests that when we're thinking about the what's real question, we should take a broadly naturalistic approach to trying to understand reality by engaging with it as honestly as we can with a healthy dose of humility. And on the ethical side, it's very pluralistic about how we might go about that, but it does insist that every sentient being at least should matter seriously in our moral consideration. But in these conversations, I'm talking to a dazzling variety of different people from different fields, some of whom agree and some of whom don't agree with that worldview. So it'll be really interesting to explore your own thinking on this. But before we get onto those big philosophical questions, how would you best introduce yourself and what you do now before we get into the deep stuff?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Thom Norman. I am the co-founder of FarmKind. We are a very new organization we launched this summer, and our mission is to basically help people to answer the question, like, what's the thing I can do best to help with factory farming, to tackle the issue of factory farming, which is a problem, not just for animals, although that's really the main thing, but also massively destructive for the planet and in putting our own health in danger. We believe that the single biggest thing that almost all of us can do is to donate to the right charities, those that are doing the kind of really doing good work with your money, using your donations wisely, that kind of thing. And so we help people to do that. We find charities and work with experts to identify some charities that are not the only great charities out there, but are some really awesome charities that are doing amazing work. And then we help make donating to those charities super easy for people.
That's great. Thank you. Really good intro. And you've queued up, I think, what will be a big theme in how to make a better world question at the back end of this conversation too. But before we head to that, let's work through your own philosophical journey personally. And the first of these big questions I like to ask is that what's real question. And epistemology is such a broad topic because it covers every domain of human knowledge and thought and belief and credences. But sometimes a good way into it is to ask how people grew up originally. Was the epistemology and the worldview that they grew up in maybe more religious or supernatural or mystical or spiritual in some way? Or was it more of a naturalistic, scientific, maybe atheistic or agnostic context? And how has that side of their thinking changed over time, if it has, on those sort of deep questions about the nature of reality and how best to understand it? So you can wind the clock back as far as you like to tell that story.
Yeah, so I think like as for many of us, childhood is like very formative. My family is very, very religious. I would say like church is a kind of integral part of not just their worldview, but also their kind of social structures and things like this, which I think I listen to some people who've been on your podcast who've had see that quite negatively and things. And for me, I think that's definitely not the case. It's like broadly a positive thing, I think. But
and what variety of religion is it?
So Church of England is sort of a classic. So Anglican kind of thing, very much, I would say, focused on I guess more on the sort of slightly, I guess, evangelical side of that sort of thing, like very focused on like what does the Bible say? It's like the kind of like guiding principle, like how they would try and interpret their religion and the guidance for them. And I think that where I kind of sort of, I guess, have the most tension with that and found that the most difficult is that often conversations when you're trying to explore something like the kind of questions we're exploring on this podcast, like these interesting philosophical questions and like trying to explore ideas, like often just sort of hits up against like, some Bible verse or but God or something like this. And that's kind of like the end of the conversation. And I think it's like a little bit unfair to put that intellectual lack of curiosity, but it's sort of similar in a sort of similar vein. So I think animals is a really good example of this, right? Where the conversation with some Christian people can go, well, humans are made in the image of God. We are sort of a point in creation above other animals. Therefore, that's kind of the end of the conversation. We don't really need to think about animals too hard. As someone who, like, increasingly throughout my life sort of took the suffering of animals very seriously, that was very difficult to kind of like, I don't think that's where the conversation should end. Right? And for many Christians, to be fair, that's not where it ends, right? But that kind of thing, I think, is a problem because you can think that humans matter more than animals and still think that animals do matter, right? We all, I think, have different values and things like that. That's fine. But I think we can still agree on basic things like suffering is bad. And from the scientific point of view, it's overwhelmingly clear that animals suffer. If there are things we can do to prevent the suffering of animals, to make it less, to eventually move away from like causing animal suffering ourselves as humans, then it seems like that's a good thing. Like it seems kind of obvious that would be a good thing, like, even if you have other values and even if other things matter more to you. Yeah, with those sorts of tensions were where my kind of religious upbringing came difficult.
So the tension was partly just the intellectual one of not liking the sort of closed answers and wanting to continue to work through things and be curious and be open. I share that very much. But then it's also this question about when it bumps up against some moral or ethical implications and it sort of shuts the door on important questions that I think you should, want to explore more. Yeah, so that's really interesting. And as you say, I've spoken to quite a lot of people who still have a religious worldview through these conversations. And there are people in almost every religious worldview who are very actively working to shift those worldviews and the people within them into a more universally compassionate space that goes way beyond the human. And in some religious worldviews, obviously that's pretty straightforward because you have concepts like ahimsa, doing no harm, not just to humans, but doing no harm at all to any being, i.e. any sentient being. So in some religions, it's a sort of an easier path. But in others, even the Abrahamic ones, again, there's ideas of moving away from ideas of dominion to stewardship and respecting God's creation. And even in a very religious worldview, most religious people still recognize the scientific validity of research into sentience, and they see that as morally salient, regardless of their meta ethics, if you like, of the religion. So I agree. There's so many different paths forward on these topics, but I think those are two interesting, like you say, stress points that I find with a sort of non-naturalistic or a supernatural worldview is that, I like the curiosity and the open-mindedness, and I'm not a fan of dogma or closed answers to questions or just ceasing the inquiry purely intellectually. But then there is that second question, which is just as serious, maybe even more, where there are blockers to our universal ethical compassion that can make that compassion conditional or restrictive or in-group focused. And, I guess those are the two of the main reasons why I like Sentientism's focus on naturalism, not just the universal compassion. Yeah. Where's that tension led you to so far? Because for some people, that might lead them away from a religious worldview to a sort of, if you like, a fully naturalistic stance. For others, they will still find a path within that religious worldview that adapts appropriately. Others will find a path that maintains a sort of cultural or community connection with those concepts, but doesn't, hold to the supernatural beliefs anymore. What sort of path have you taken personally, given those tensions?
I used to spend a fair amount of time trying to grapple with these questions because I think it's really interesting, and I think both I just think it's inherently quite interesting topics, but I'm not sure what I think. I think lots of good people and very intelligent people disagree about these questions, and therefore this suggests that they're very complicated questions. And so I was reading various different philosophers, both some sort of apologetics and also some very much of philosophy coming from a sort of more secular point of view and trying to explore these issues. I don't fundamentally know what I think, but And I think where I came to was a sort of, I guess, like a pragmatism in that although pragmatism is not a great theory from like an epistemic point of view, I think actually as a way of like living our lives, it's kind of what most of us sort of do. And it's a pretty good way to operate. So it's useful to think about what kind of version of the world do I see that like allows me to operate and allows me to move through it, even if epistemically or ethically that's not 100% perfectly logically sound. I think it's a good way to move. And I really like that point you made at the beginning about humility. I think we all have slightly different views, and we need to be very clear that we're not sure that we're right? And so having space for slightly different views and slightly different sets of values, I think is really important. At Farmkind, we are focused on, okay, how do we help the most animals, help to deal with factory farming as an issue in the greatest amount for the money that our donors give. But we also think that that's not the only thing that our donors might care about. That's not the only thing that people care about. And so one of the interesting things about our platform is we have this kind of split donation splitting mechanism where we ask people, we recommend these charities. These charities are really good and they will do a really good job. But we also say you can donate to the cause that's closest to your heart. You split your donation between the two. We give you a little bonus on both donations. And this kind of captures this idea of like, we have multiple values. There are things that we care about beyond just doing the most good with our dollar. And maybe we care about helping people that are close to us in our local community, or we care about farming. Factory farming is an issue, but we also care about, if, for example, a dealing with a particular disease that is like very, emotionally salient to us, or we just think, I don't feel comfortable just giving to animals. And so we've kind of built this platform that allows people to like hold these different values and deal with the tension that it can sometimes be and not have to make those trade-offs. So I think that's an interesting way it kind of fits into this.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance. You can have the sort of the hardcore rationalistic bit, but you can also have something that maybe might be more gut feel or personal or intuitive that you can accommodate as well. Yeah, it's an interesting model.
Sometimes I think people who think about this kind of more rationalistic, it can feel very invalidating of those other emotions and those other reasons to donate and those other reasons to want to do good. And I think it's very important that we don't disregard like those emotional reasons. They are important and they're an important part of why we do good.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things I've personally shifted my focus on is maybe in the earlier days, I was focused a bit more on the sort of ontology questions of the actual nature of reality. And more I've become more focused on the epistemology, the sort of toolkit we use to work stuff out, because that, to my mind, feels like the more important thing to get right, because it's not standing in opposition to supernatural beliefs. It's standing in opposition to dogma, or maybe fideism, belief without evidence, or an unquestioned authority, which again is just another form of dogma. So it's standing against those types of maybe arbitrary or fabricated ways of believing and saying, look, we should engage honestly with reality as we find it and with humility. And I think doing that also mitigates the risk that you often find in many people who are, very aggressive atheists, for example, that they seem to have fallen into maybe their own sort of dogma. They're so absolutely determined that they found the right answer on that one question that they are no longer open to countervailing evidence. And there's always some, but also that confidence can overspill into other areas as well, where people are so confident that they're right about one thing, they start to feel like they are 100% correct on everything else. And a really good, naturalistic epistemology is never 100% sure about anything. There's always at least some openness to even crazy and weird ideas, right? If the evidence comes through, then that's it. So in a way that, yes, many people with a religious worldview will say that's based on faith, and basically there is nothing that will change my view. But there are also people with a religious worldview, or at least an openness to that, who will say, well, no, I actually have a naturalistic worldview and my religious belief is grounded in my view of the evidence and the reasoning, and fine, we can criticize and challenge that, work it through. But it does leave that space for quite a wide range of different opinions. But the important thing, I think, is that we can still constructively maintain that ability to compare evidence and reason together and work things out, which maybe is also another part of your sort of pragmatic style too, that you want to have some basis for a cooperation and discussion that we can work on together. And if something's purely dogmatic, like you say, the door's shut, there's nowhere else to go, right? You can't really work forward from there. So yeah, thank you. Well, that's been really interesting to explore that. And like you say, it's an interesting tie into farm kinds that you're trying to address the sort of the head and the heart balance too. So maybe let's get into the second question, the questions of ethical foundations, really. And a common sense way of asking this is to say, okay, what matters? So if we might agree broadly on a sort of naturalistic approach for understanding reality, a really important question is, okay, well, what matters? What should we care about in that context? So again, I'd be interested in your personal journey, even from the earliest days, of how you thought about that sort of stuff. What do right and wrong and good and bad even mean? And, is there something at the root? Is there an ethical foundation that all of your thinking now comes down to, or not? But again, tell a story however you like.
So again, I do think that one of the things I think has been definitely at the core of how I've gone through my life is a clear sense that whatever exactly this means, like doing good is a fundamentally important thing to be doing. So I think, moving from, I was a lawyer previous to what I do now, and sort of leaving behind that world, that's a pretty safe career, to move to this like world of startup charity founding. It was definitely motivated by a clear sense that like doing good rather than simply like having a nice life is a very important thing to do. I do attribute that to coming in from a religious upbringing. I'm not to say that like that's the only way you can get there, but I think that's how I got there.
And what in that context, if you were to summarize to me now, what does doing good mean in that Anglican Christian context? What were the messages? Because even within that context, there's a bunch of different paths you can follow. Right? One is about being compassionate and doing good and loving their neighbor as thyself, and there can also be more of a flavor that it's ultimately doing good is doing what God wants, and it's a divine command theory thing that in a way you're not loving their neighbor as thyself because you care about them. Ultimately, you're doing it because the guy upstairs is telling you to do it. So, what sort of flavor came through your upbringing in that community? That's what did good mean in that context?
Yeah, it's a good distinction to draw. So I would say that that community probably is more in the second camp, and the doing good means following what God wants you to do and that sort of thing. And I think that I guess that while I took the importance of ethics and doing good to that stayed with me, what that means has then shifted for me over time to much more an ethics that's not rooted in some supernatural set of orders, but is more, I think broadly, I would say I'm pretty convinced that like, even if it's not clear exactly what all the good things are, suffering is like, I think we could almost all agree suffering is very bad. And so if you can do things that reduce suffering in the world or like increase positive emotions and affect, then this is like almost certainly good. Like and I think the thing is like, Toby Ord talks about like, testing your worldview from different types of worldviews, right? And like, there are very few coherent moral frameworks that would say that like reducing suffering is bad. And so I'm not sure what the right answer is, but I think I can be pretty convinced that if I try to reduce suffering and dedicate my kind of actions towards trying to reduce suffering for non-human animals, for humans too, that is probably good, whatever ethical framework turns out to be the right one. And so that's I guess how I tend to operate. If I had to like hedge my view, I would say that probably I think I would be a deontologist. I don't think that like I'm not a utilitarian myself, but I think there are probably these values that exist, like justice and fairness, as well as suffering. What is right is probably some combination of trying to like stay as close to those values as possible.
Yeah, thank you. And that sort of anticipates my next question, because in that, I think you're right that lots of people would agree that generally, suffering is a bad thing and flourishing or well-being or, is a good thing. It's almost baked into the definitions of the words. And some people will try and make a distinction between, the good and bad of my experience and the good and bad of, morality. But personally, I'm quite comfortable drawing a fairly strong link between those two things, in that you experience suffering as bad, and that's why me needlessly causing you to is a morally bad thing. I mean, that seems to sort of fit quite well. And I agree, you can sort of run that through quite a lot of different ethical philosophies as well. And hopefully it is a sort of common consensus that lots of people could agree with. Although, talking about this stuff on the internet never ceases to amaze me, the opinions and the takes you'll find. Anyway, But even there's a few different ways into that. So for some people, they do think of it more and this is maybe a caricature of the utilitarian approach. They think of it more in a sort of spreadsheet way where, sentient beings are just anonymous containers of utility and you value utility positively and negatively and you add it all up. And that can feel a little bit cold and calculating, like you've lost the connection with the individuals. For others, it's much more a sort of empathic connection, a sort of imagining what it's like to be somebody else. And from that perspective, that's why I value it, because I know what, I can guess what it would be like for you to feel pain. And that almost definition is just why I think it's important, because that's what morality seems to be for me. And still other people, so that's more about identifying with the other and empathic connection with the other. Still other people, it's maybe a more sort of legalistic approach, which can tap into some of the things you were talking about justice and fairness and those are the concepts that really drive it. And still others will take a more virtue-based approach, which is, yes, maybe it's interested in others, but somewhat indirectly, because the most important thing is that I and others are being virtuous in that context. So and I guess you sort of answered it there. You're not a utilitarian. There's suffering and well-being are really important, but ideas like justice and maybe rights and those other things play into you in a more pluralistic way. Is that a fair sort of summary of how you come to it?
I think that many of these theories have some things that are pretty helpful about them, right? So the concept that you can do more good or less good, and all things considered, aiming towards doing more good is better, which is in a sense, in a very simplified sense, that's sort of what utilitarians are. And I think that there's just something that's unerring logic to that, right? There's something that's just very difficult to argue why that should not be the case. At the same time, I think you put it perfectly. When we're acting as ethical beings, we're not getting out a spreadsheet. There is clearly something emotional going on, and I think it would seem strange and very non-naturalistic view of ethics to say that can't be the right way to go about it, right? Because clearly emotions are part of how we make all other decisions.
Yeah, those emotions exist, right? They are part of the natural world, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And they're part of how we make all kinds of decisions, ethical decisions and other decisions too. And to try to abstract ethics from that, I think seems to be playing kind of, games with the reality and not really engaging with it in its full sense. But the one thing I do really quite love about virtue ethics is this sense of the doing good because you're a good person. And I think you can, again, utilitarianism can use this. It's like the sort of thought experiment where they say, well, if you sit by somebody's bed as they're dying and they say, really glad you came to sit with me. And they say, oh, it's okay. I mean, this is clearly the right thing to do. It's producing the most utility for me to be here. That's why I'm here. They would, they're not happy, right? They want you to be there because you want to be there.
Yeah.
And an ethics that takes into account that we also do good because we are good or just want to be good people. There's an ethical theory without that aspect is also missing something. So all these different things, they all have I guess it's the cliche of the blind people and the elephant. They're all touching on some things that seem important about this grand question of what it means to do good.
Yeah, and I think over this series of conversations, that's one thing that's happened to my own personal thinking, which isn't so relevant really, but it's got more pluralistic, right? So I can see the sort of value of those different things. Now there's one interesting question which can expose a challenge with just focusing on suffering and well-being, which is, the wrongness of killing in isolation, right? So if you imagine I crept into your house this evening and you had no family or friends or anyone who cared about you and I euthanized you quietly in your sleep, would you see that as something that's ethically wrong, given I haven't actually caused any suffering at all?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. It's a question that comes up in the case of animals, right? Quite a lot, where people are saying, well, is the problem that we're killing the animals, or is it how we treat them before we kill them, and all these kinds of things? And I mean, I guess in that context, the obvious response is, well, this is not what's going on in our slaughterhouses and factory farms. So that's what we were doing.
And I think that's an important point to make, right? Is that it bears no relation to animal agriculture whatsoever, right? Anyway, but we can come back to that at a later point. Yeah,
it is good to underline that for sure. But on the specific point itself, yeah, I think this is why to simply address things in a spreadsheet in terms of utilitarians or what have you is clearly missing something, because I think there are very few of us out there who would suggest that was an appropriate behavior.
Yeah. We tend to call it murder. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we got a name for that one. Even if we imagine that that person, like, they weren't going to have any other good experience in their life, there's still something that's like clearly wrong to most of us about that.
Yeah. And I think even in the utilitarian context, there are arguments against it too, because people talk about, the foregoing the potential future utility of that life. But as you said, even if their life thereafter might be terrible, one is, well, okay, is that from our perspective or their perspective? And if we're judging their utility from outside, there's an immediate risk that we're taking on. And that brings into view other ideas like agency and autonomy and the rights of individuals to decide what's important for them, right? So again, that's another area where that pluralism can help you just sort of watch you don't go off the deep end with too narrow an ethical theory. But yeah, thank you. So that's really interesting. You've got that sort of pluralistic approach where you can sort of take magpie light from different ethical theories and use them to sort of cross-check each other. But you've got this core confidence that, suffering is a bad thing and therefore needlessly causing it is a bad thing, and something that hopefully we can build some consensus around. So the second part of the question is about who matters, because I think many people in these sorts of conversations get to this point and would just be nodding and smiling and saying, the average human would have listened to what you and I have just said and go, that sounds about right. Suffering is bad and killing is wrong, and fine, virtue ethics and blah, 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 rights, bit of justice. Yeah, that sounds great. Let's move forward on that basis. But they would only be thinking about humans, and some of them might only be thinking about a subgroup of, an in-group of humans too. And we know the problems that can lead to. So what's your journey been in terms of moral scope? Who gets to matter? Because, typically as young kids, we intuitively think of family and friends and those around us. And then over time, that scope expands and shifts in different ways. What's your journey been on that front, and how do you do that now? Do you set a moral scope, and what's the criteria if such a thing makes sense?
Yeah, so I actually would slightly push back on the characterization that most people would, it would stop at the humans around them, maybe, because I think the thing when it comes particularly to animals is that actually when it comes down to all other things being equal, I think almost everybody does really care about animal suffering, right? There are cases, there's a really famous case of a lady in the UK who put a cat in a bin, and it was like all over the news for ages. There was a footballer, I think, who kicked a cat, and that was national scandal. People were very, very upset about it.
Total outrage, yeah.
Exactly. And like reasonably so, right? Like, but then also when people have, farm animals as pets or experience them in other circumstances, there's a natural empathy that we do have. And I think what gets in the way of that and makes us stop thinking and stop caring about, as many beings as we might otherwise do, is that it's not always all the other things considered, right? So we're like, well, I do care about these animals, but I also want to continue eating animals or wearing animals or whatever it is. And I think that's where, if I accept that I really think that these animals matter, I'm going to have to make all these behavior changes. And I think that's where we often come unstuck.
Yeah, it's more about the fear of the implications of a philosophical shift than it is the philosophy itself. Yeah.
Yes, I think so. And I think that's where I think ultimately being consistent with your values is important and is a good thing to do. But I think there are other things we can also accept that we care about animals and accept that there's some inconsistency in our view for a while, and it can be a work in progress, right? Like, it doesn't mean that, like, once you accept that there's a moral imperative, moral good to do a thing, it doesn't mean that tomorrow your life has to be 100% completely transformed, because that's not practical. It's not how people live their lives. We can move towards these things. We can work on these things. So, for example, we would say, like, one thing you can do to help animals that isn't changing your diet right away is, for example, donating to help animals. And you can actually have as much good for animals or more good by giving relatively small amounts of money than you would have by changing your diet. And for those people who aren't ready to make those kinds of dietary changes or lifestyle changes, this can be a very easy way to, like, bring themselves more into line with their values than they otherwise would be.
I think that's a fair pushback. I think it's fair to say that our, dominant culture and the way that is expressed is brutally anthropocentric, and there are sort of very selective exceptions to that. But I do think you're right, and that's partly what gives me some hope, is that I think most humans already extend their moral consideration beyond, the human species, at least in some ways, and that there's a sort of latent ethics there, but maybe we can tap into. We can come back to later. So yeah, but I'm interested in your sort of journey through that thinking so far, because clearly you're now, you've co-founded a charity that's focused specifically on the non-human animal space. So what was the journey that took you to take that seriously?
Really, I think it is this realization that I would say where I started off was I was immediately to like almost everybody, right?
You were normal. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Like I was just like everybody else. And I remember that sort of transition to thinking more expansively about my morals. I remember really clearly how it happened for me was there were a couple of instances where my partner would mention, like, I don't know, like there was an advert on the tube of like, say, Go Vegan or something like this. And like, there are a couple of instances you point this out. And I immediately, like each of those conversations, I quite quickly shut them down. And I quite quickly, like, I had quite a strong like reaction to this. I was like, well, yeah, obviously factory farming is terrible, but we need system reform, legislation, this kind of thing. Like that's the answer, right? Stop talking to me now. And I then questioned to myself, like, well, I am definitely reacting strongly to this. Like, why am I not just having this conversation like a normal conversation? Why am I getting emotionally involved in this so quickly? And I think it was because deep down I did think that probably there was something wrong with like how I was behaving. And like, yes, legislation is important. Ultimately, the solutions to these problems are systemic because these are systemic problems, right? But at that time, like me just saying, yes, we need systemic change is not really helping. It's not actually doing anything. And it was just a way to avoid me having to actually engage with this problem. And when I realized that sort of sent me on this journey to learning more about the problems and learning about, so I went vegetarian and then had this kind of one of the sort of naive assumption that because we're not killing egg-laying hens and we're not killing cows, that therefore their lives must be fine. And then I read the book Eating Animals, Jonathan Safran-Foer, and just discovering it's a really usefully written, great book by a non-vegan, like just a vegetarian guy. It's still a fascinating book, and just having my eyes open to how the industry actually is. That was kind of a moment. Okay, like clearly this is not something I want to be part of. That was sort of the transition for me to completely stopping eating all animal products. But I think if I could sum it up, I think it is just actually becoming in touch with where my ethics really were underneath the surface, and pulling aside these kind of like, oh, but if I accept that, then I'll have to change this, or like the excuse of like, oh yeah, it's somebody else's problem, it's not for me to deal with. And I think by doing that, I was actually able to come more in line with really how I ethically wanted to show up in the world.
And what did that transition feel like? Because psychologically, it sounds like that was probably quite a refreshing, freeing, positive feeling of like, there's no such thing as perfection, right? But I've taken a big step to acting more in line with my values. So one, I'm interested in, psychologically, what did it feel like to go through that transition? But also, what was it like for you, socially, family, friends? What sort of response did you get? Was that difficult, challenging, or?
So psychologically, I think, it was definitely actually quite, especially going from being like that sort of the beginning of the journey to like sort of the, I don't want to say the end point. So like you say, when none of us are perfect, there's always like ways for us to consider how we're showing up in the world and our consumption habits and what we're doing with our time and our resources. But from where I am now, I think it definitely was a sense of both psychologically freeing and a sort of moving away from a feeling of guilt, but also a sense of mission and a sense of this is like a real injustice, and this is something I actually now really want to go forward and try to do everything I can to try to make this better. From a sort of friends and family point of view, I went through the same phase I think many vegans do of like being the angry vegan, trying to persuade everyone and talk about it all the time, which is not good. It doesn't work.
I'm still in that some days, I tell you.
Yeah. I mean, we all have days like vegan days for sure, but but broadly, I think people were I was lucky. I know this isn't how it is for most people, but I had very little pushback from people. I had the frustration of them not coming on that journey with me because I discovered this thing and I wanted everyone to like come along and do it too.
Yeah, it's hard.
Some people have a really tough time, and I was extremely lucky.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess back to this question of, that's a fascinating journey, and it's quite similar to mine, although mine was slower than yours, so let's not go into that. The question of moral scope, who gets to count, the animal advocacy space and veganism centers on the word animal. And for some people that defines their moral scope. All animals matter. For me, the reason I care about animals is because in a way it's a shorthand for sentient beings. And of course there are exceptions and, areas of uncertainty around that, but it's a really good shorthand to say, animals are basically, the reason I care about animals is because they are sentient, because they can experience things, because they can feel, they have their own interest, their own perspective. And for me, morality is, caring about them, aspiring to care about them in the same way they value their own lives, and the ability to value your own life, even in a minimal sense, is sentient. So that's partly why I've focused on this idea of sentience. But there are other options as well. So some people will say, look, no, I focus on animality itself, regardless of sentience. Other people, in fact, some of the first times the word sentientism was used as a term was to criticize it and say, look, it's not going far enough. What about biocentrism? What about living things that aren't sentient? Shouldn't they matter intrinsically as moral patients? Or even ecocentrism, where you think about, the earth has Gaia, rocks, rivers, trees, and maybe even the rights of nature. And, shouldn't we go way beyond? So on that sort of stuff, do you find sentience a useful guide to your moral scope or something else? How do you think about the sort of boundaries of this question?
Yeah, I think it is really interesting. As I mentioned briefly, coming from a sort of law background, these arguments about whether we should give rights to non-sentient geographical elements and things like this. I used to really enjoy those kinds of those discussions. It's fascinating. There's a great book called Should Trees Have Standing, which kind of goes through the legal history and exploration of different giving legal rights to various things, whether it be trees or rivers and things like this. It's fascinating. But I think sentience is a really good start because it comes back to this thing about suffering, right? And I think a really good starting point for thinking, as you put it, that we can almost all agree about is that suffering is bad. And so if we at least start there, there's enough to do in the world. There's a lot of bad things. I think we can all agree about this. We're not going to fix them all overnight. And I think it can be very easy to also become overwhelmed by how much suffering and how many problems there are in the world, right? We have to start somewhere, and we also have to segment problems. So everything is, we talk about issues like intersectionality and things like this. I think these are really valuable things to say, but we also have to segment issues artificially to a degree and say, like, okay, I'm going to focus on this thing. So in our case, we focus on factory farming, not because it's the only thing that matters, not because we think that, farmed animals matter more than other animals, or because they matter more than humans or things like this, but simply because we have to start with something. This is a lot of beings that are suffering a huge amount. It's something we can actually affect a large amount for a very small amount of money. We can do a surprising amount of good, surprisingly easily for these beings. And so we start there, but that doesn't mean that has to be where we end. And I think it's always about, balancing the practicalities of where we are and where we want to go with all these competing demands. So I think for me, sentience is a really good framework for saying, okay, we can be pretty confident that beings that suffer matter, and let's address that. And once we're in a world where that is no longer a problem, let's explore these other things as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. So let's come on to the final question about how do we make a better world. And one, I'm interested in your sort of super big picture view that you were somewhat hinting at there about how do we make positive change. Because if we share a broadly naturalistic understanding of reality, and we share at least this sort of sentiocentric moral scope that every sentient being should matter, the next question is, okay, what are we going to do about it? Which, like you say, is a daunting, scary question for us two individual human sentient beings with our limited capacities, but it's fun to try. So one, if you've got any big picture views about a sort of theory of change and a utopian end state you get to, that would be fascinating. But obviously it would be great to then delve into FarmKind and what you're trying to do there and how that works and some of the criticisms and challenges you might face too. But I don't know if you have any sort of big picture thoughts about how to make a better world before we pragmatically zero in on, your new venture.
I think one of the things about our food system and about factory farming in general is it feels, because of its scale and because it's so ingrained in how we eat, about 98% of the meat that if you're American, is from a factory farm. In the UK, it's something like 80%. It feels like it's this kind of thing that is never going to go away. It's sort of like it's here for good. And I think it's almost certain that system will be history in some amount of time, some fairly small amount of time. And I think our job is actually just to speed that up. We're not trying to push against the tide. We're actually just trying to speed things up because it's a massively inefficient system, right? Like if we moved away from animal farming completely, we could feed 4 billion more people with the amount of land that we currently use for animal agriculture. That's before we take into account the massive environmental damage that is done by animals, the pandemic risks, the increase to antibiotic resistant diseases. This is not a good system.
And that's true even if you had a strictly anthropocentric moroscope where you didn't care about the farmed animals whatsoever, right? I mean, the arguments against it are absolutely overwhelming on almost every dimension. And there may be some wishful thinking in my head, but I really don't think there is, right? There is no, I sometimes like to ask is if those systems did not exist and someone proposed starting them up, you would think they'd lost their minds. I mean, in every single respect. And there's something insidious about the inertia of the systems that seems to become an argument for them continuing in its own right, because people cannot conceive of them ending. So they immediately get drawn into, how do we tweak it? Or how do we, because it is just a factor of the matter that we must continue in, it cannot be stopped, right? So it's quite refreshing for you to say, we're trying to accelerate its end, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, these arguments about the environment and they stand, even if you think that all animals are like little robots that they don't matter at all, right? Factory farming is actively bad for us as people as well as for animals. And so our kind of the way we think about how our theory of change around this issue is very much focused on, can we help the animals that are being farmed now to have better lives? Because that transition, however fast or slow it is, it's going to be a transition. Can we improve conditions for them? Can we also make alternatives easier for people to access right now, so we can reduce the amount of food that people are eating, the amount of animal products people are using, start to bring that transition forward? And then also, can we help organizations and support them to find the foods of the future, which are going to allow us to have a new food system that is less cruel, that is less of a strain on our environment, that is also healthy and sustainable. And so we're focused on that. I guess it's like a journey that we're on. We're working with organizations that touch on each of those points of that journey, so we can help bring the end of the factory farming era closer. And I think, if we to paint the vision of that future, it's a vision where we need to use much less land than we currently do to feed ourselves as humans, which means we can turn land back over to the wild, and we can start to reverse some of that species loss. So we can start to really tackle climate change by reforesting and bringing back wilds, but also by removing the amount of methane emissions we have in the atmosphere, which are some of the both highest polluting gases and also ones that break down fastest. So actually it allows us to really come back against them and reducing some of these health risks as well. So I think by tackling this one issue, we're actually able to help the world, both humans and non-humans, on all these different aspects of some of the biggest problems that we as a world are currently facing. So I think it's a very exciting challenge and a very exciting place to be working as well.
Yeah. And the focus on factory farming, I think, can play out a few different ways. One is it's often framed as a good faith way of pragmatically, at least as a transition, leaving space for global communities that have a genuine survival or sustenance dependency on forms of animal agriculture that I don't think anyone really sees as the priority now, even though we see deep ethical problems in there, because those systems have victims too. Right? So in a way, it's a good faith way of saying, look, let's focus on the sort of Western Eurocentric industrial stuff, right? Because that's where the scale is, that's where the most egregious harms are, and because those other types of sustenance or survival based animal agriculture and exploitation would need a very different sort of transition path. So hence the focus on factory farming. But there's another approach which some people will take, and this is where some of the criticisms come in. We'll say, factory farming's bad, everyone can agree with that, maybe because we have a focus on some of the more egregious forms of suffering that factory farming constrains. But by implication, because we're focusing on factory farming, that leaves open the door for other types of animal agriculture and exploitation, where maybe the animals have just got a bit more space, maybe they're allowed to live a little bit longer, but ultimately the worst parts of the process for the animals are still there, right? There's the artificial insemination, there's the family separation, there's the mutilations, and ultimately they all end up in the slaughterhouse. So the really cynical view is, if we just focus on factory farming, is there a risk we're just enabling a massive ethics washing rebranding of the animal agriculture industry? So could you see an end state where there is no more factory farming, but actually animal agriculture is even bigger than it was before, but they've just changed the labels and, there's still catastrophic suffering? And I guess that's one of the core themes of the challenges to some of the welfare interventions you're talking about, because I think most people look at those welfare interventions and say, well, of course, living in a massively overstocked barn of 10,000 chickens is awful, but it's not as bad as being in a cage, right? That's a real difference, particularly when you can make that difference for hundreds of millions of animals, right? That is an improvement, but it's not an end state we want. So there's this worry about the welfare interventions that it may actually be co-opted by the industry into persisting something that ultimately is still ethically horrific. So how do you navigate that sort of tension?
Yeah, I think it's a real concern, and I think it's a really important thing for us to bear in mind. What we don't want to be doing is acting as humane washers. I think I would separate. I think there are two questions that we have to deal with when it comes to this problem of animal agriculture and factory farming. One is, how do we make the lives of the animals that are suffering tomorrow, right in the immediate future, much less bad than they would otherwise be? And this is where these interventions for cage-free campaigns, which are incredibly cost-effective, you can help thousands of chickens for really small amounts of money, helping millions of chickens to have considerably better lives than they otherwise would. Thanks to cage-free campaigns, we've gone from about 5% of US egg-laying hens being cage-free to about 40% over around about a 15-year period. That is an incredible transition, considering the number of hens is actually growing over that period of time as well, right? So it's not like it's both the population has grown and the number of cage-free has massively grown over that period of time. So we're doing some amazing work as an animal movement on that, but that can't be all we do. So we also need to be looking to the future. And I think that's where things like cultivated meat, where making plant-based alternatives as well more available to people, these are crucial to moving to a future food system that is better than the one we had on all these points. Because to these points around, not just around animal welfare, but also around things like the environmental impacts, those are not constrained just to factory farming, right? Like the environmental impacts of animal agriculture, arguably in some cases, worse if you move to a less intensive farming system, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Longer lives, more space, more emissions, more pollution.
Certainly more land use, which is a big driver of some of these climate concerns. And so what we need to be doing is thinking about, okay, we need to make there's the triage. How do we make the lives of animals right now better? And there's also the long-term vision of where do we want to get to, and where we want to get to is eventually a sustainable food system, a food system that can feed everybody in a way that isn't putting our planet at risk, isn't putting our health at risk, and isn't exploiting animals. And so we're trying to support organizations that are working on both of these areas.
And I think that is an important distinction. And some might criticize me and say it's a bit of a cop-out, right? But I think there is an important distinction between an organization or an individual who sees, a supposedly high welfare, humane, and I'm using air quotes here for our audio listeners, form of animal exploitation as the end state, and people who are working on welfare improvements because they have immediate benefits, but also because they're part of a path to ultimately try to end the animal exploitation, because we simply just do not need to do it. Right? So, and I think that is a really important distinction. And I recognize that, maybe that can be difficult, because if your welfare campaign is engaging with corporations, there's some messaging challenges there, because your message is, look, this is good for your business to, harm animals less because ultimately consumers care. But your other message is, and we want to see your industry end. So, and if you want to continue as a company, then you need to transition very rapidly to a different form of protein production, right? So So I understand that tension, but I think it's so important to maintain that clarity on the end goal, because these industries are clever, right? The dead ends are absolutely beckoning, regenerative farming, high welfare, humane slaughter. The dead ends are, we're being ushered towards them at every moment. So I think that's part of the challenge, is maintaining that clarity, and that ethical clarity.
Yeah, I think for sure. I think it's worth also saying that relative to other kinds of, I guess, broadly cause areas, so the animal movement compared to environment movement or global health is very small in terms of the money that it has, but also fairly young. And there is still a degree of experimentation. There are some things we know that work, like corporate campaigns is a good example of something we can demonstrate very clearly that we can help animals. That we've seen these commitments from corporates, or we've seen companies deliver on these commitments. But we are also still looking for other amazing interventions, right? What are the other things we can do that are really going to shift the needle on this? And there is still a lot of exploration. And that's why we don't just say, these are the best charities, donate to these charities. We say, these are some really great charities. We think you can donate to them. And you can also donate, we can also allow you to, split your donate to other things, because it might be that there's some other charity that's not on our list that's also doing amazing work.
Yeah, makes sense. And that's one thing that's clear from your work, is that you're trying to address that funding gap, because, like you say, given the scale of the problem we're facing and the ethical horror of it, not to mention the other problems that spin off it, the amount of money that's dedicated through charitable endeavors or, other forms of financial support are tiny compared to that. So one of the things you're trying to do is address that funding gap and bring more money into it. Something I'd wholeheartedly support, because when you compare the amount of money that's on animal advocacy as funding, even to things like guide dogs for the blind or other forms of, ultimately greenwashed and ethics washed, wild animal concern like RSPCA and RSPB and other organizations around the world. I mean, they are absolutely awash with money compared to those people who are trying to end animal exploitation. And then when you look into other causes, whether it's global poverty or, disease problems or, again, those causes are underfunded too, but compared to the animal advocacy space, it's a radical gap. At the same time, and I think everyone involved in this movement broadly would want to see more money come in. But one of the other challenges that's been put towards maybe some of the more wealth-oriented large charities and maybe some of the effective altruist space that are thinking about the animal world is, and there's a great book called The Good It Promises, the Harm It Does, which is really challenging the effective altruism's approach to the animal topic specifically. So you can put aside the sort of generic Twitter sphere stuff that thinks effective altruism is, they're either attacking it through do-gooder derogation, which I think is awful, or they think it's some sort of Peter Thiel tech bro elitist plan to colonize Mars and loads of other planets while ignoring very real problems here, right? So we can put those types of, EA discourse to one side, but there's some really interesting, well thought through challenges to how effective altruism addresses the animal space in this book. And I've been lucky to interview quite a few of the chapter authors, and I won't summarize all the challenges here, but one is that fear about, is welfareism really going to take us where we need to go versus an abolitionist end goal? There's also a sense that focusing on charitable donations and market mechanisms is maybe missing some of the sort of deeper democratic or political or grassroots way of engaging. But there's also a fear that in trying to bring more money into the field, which I think everyone would love to see, that some of the funding is also being taken away from some of the more traditional grassroots. Maybe it's animal sanctuaries, maybe it's veganism advocacy, people who've been working in this space for decades and decades and decades and, are quite invested in those approaches and feel that some of the funding or the attention is being taken away from a sort of big corporatized NGO approach that's going to drive to improve welfare campaigns. So I should stop rambling on, but I'm interested in whether, you've had a chance to engage with any of those sorts of criticisms and how you think you can mitigate them and respond to them.
I can't say I haven't read that book, but I'm familiar really in a very broad sense with some of the arguments. And I think that it is true that some of the successes of things like corporate campaigns, some of the focus from some of the large effectiveness-minded donors has moved in the movement towards these big campaigns much more so over the last few years. I think one of the reasons for this is because the movement is just so small in terms of money. And so even a few large donors can have a massive impact on where the money goes in total. We had around $200 million a year farm animal funders. This is, I mean, the meat industry is about 2 trillion. So, these are very, very different numbers here, right?
It's proper David and Goliath, yeah.
Yes, I'd say if it was David and Goliath, because I worked this out for fun, Goliath is basically his torso and up is outside of the atmosphere in terms of the scale performance, right? Like that's how big the difference is between the movement. And considering that, it's amazing the work that the movement has achieved over the last decades, because they've had some real wins when they are up against an absolute behemoth in terms of lobbying spending, in terms of advertising, in terms of government support, all these things that the industry can draw on. And when we only have around $200 million. But to address the kind of substantive point about are we missing things? I think we should be humble, right? I think on the one hand, if you can help an animal in a sanctuary, it's going to cost you to say keep them around for a year, give them a nice life. Not to disparage that, it's a good thing, but it's going to cost maybe a few thousand dollars to look after an animal for a year. We could make the lives literally thousands of chickens substantially better for that amount of money. We could help hundreds, almost thousands of pigs. We can help animals a massive amount for that large amount of money. We have to really think about when we don't have enough money, about where we put that money. And so I think that's important to bear in mind. But having said that, we also need to be humble about nobody actually knows how we're going to bring factory farming to one yet, because we haven't done it yet. And it is definitely possible that some of the things that we think are the best solutions will turn out to be good, but not the best things we could be doing. And so we need to be a pluralistic movement, and we need to be looking and exploring different approaches and being also inclusive of the things that matter to people. To come back to my point earlier about having different values, like it's not for any one of us to come in and say, I know the right answer. I know how you should be doing your giving or your helping animals, your good work.
Yeah. And I think part of that is also recognizing, how we measure these things and being sensitive again to our earlier part of the conversation that, not everything fits into a spreadsheet, because I think, the sanctuary model is one really interesting example. I've, interviewed Ilana Brell, who's wrote one of those chapters and has talked about the sanctuary model. And, I think he would acknowledge the point about, how many animals can you actually help with money in a sanctuary, but they will often point to some of the second order or softer factors about, maybe sanctuaries are providing a model for human interspecies relations that could have a wider impact on the culture or the messaging or the social norms. So I think you're right. As long as you sort of broaden out the way you think about the stories we tell to each other and how social norms change and ripples of influence and stuff, as long as we're open-minded and humble in that context, then there's space for a lot of pluralistic approaches, I guess.
Myself and Father, we're not here to tell anyone you're doing it wrong. You're going about your donating wrong, or you should be donating to this charity, not this charity. All we're here to say is this is an issue that really matters because it's bad for the planet, it's bad for health, and crucially, it's really bad for animals. And these are some organizations that are doing a lot of good in these particular ways to address this issue. And we think that's a good thing to donate to, and we think you can do a lot of good by doing that. But we're not saying that's the only good thing that you can do and the only thing that matters. That's why we built the model to allow for the splitting. That's why we give people a bonus on both their favorite charity and our donation, because we think that sanctuaries can also be good too. And it's not a bad thing to donate to your local sanctuary. It's just also can be a good thing to donate to, for example, the Humane League or Synergia or something like that.
Yeah, so that's part of the mindset of your model. It allows people that space to vote with their money, if you like, in a different way, in a different context. You could give to a local animal sanctuary as well as to one of the more formalized evaluating charities at the same time. So maybe that's a good way to explain how FarmKind works. What will people's experience be like, and and how does the system work? How does the money work? And what's the flow as you go through that process if people are interested in plugging into it?
We know that when you donate, you have a bunch of reasons that you donate for. You want to do a lot of good. You want your money to be used wisely by charities, to not go to just the CEO's pay or all these kinds of other things. You want it to actually be used to do the thing that the charity says it does. But you also care about your local shelter, or there's a particular cause that really matters to you. And what we've designed our platform to do is to address the whole of the reasons that you donate. Like, if you like, engage with you as a whole donor, not just this one part or this other part.
Yeah. And I guess even that is still only addressing one part of someone's influence on the world. It's just the charity donation bit. Like, they might be a local activist, they might vote in a certain way, they might campaign, fine. But this is about, your charitable donation as a chunk of that. Yeah.
Absolutely. We are all about people's donations. That is by no means the only way to do good. It just happens to be a really convenient way for most of us to do good. And for many of us, surprisingly, one of the best things that we can do, even with relatively small amounts of money. And so we have very quickly got a small tangent. We calculated how much, based on the charities that we support and their data about how much good they can do with your dollars, how much money you'd have to donate to help animals as much as the average American diet is roughly impacting them negatively. So if you imagine, how much do I need to give to do as much good as going vegan for a year? And it's about $23 a month. So we have a calculator on our website that people can look at and like put their own diet in and see what it would look like for them. But it just underscores that actually donation is one of the most powerful things that any of us can do, because most of us have to work. We all have jobs. You can't give all your time for volunteering. You can go vegan, but that's only going to help the animals you were going to eat. And that's the hard limit on the number of animals you're going to eat. But with our donations, we can actually do a huge amounts of good relatively easily. You sort of set it, you do it, fill in the details once, set it, forget it, and you just cash in all that good feeling, going forward. But how we do it is we're an online platform. You come to us, you pick your favorite charity. It can be any 501c3 registered organization. And then we have a list of 6 charities that we've worked with experts to identify as really amazing organizations doing really good work that is measured and evaluated and demonstrated to be extremely good work on tackling this issue of factory farming. And as I say, tackling it both in terms of the welfare of animals now and also in terms of the future of food. And you can then, you choose your favorite charity, you choose effective charities, or you can just say, I want to do them all. We have a little impact fund, so you can just donate to all of them at the same time. You don't even have to think about it. And then you simply split your donation between the two. So you say, I would like to give, say, 70% of my donation to these recommended charities and 30% to my favorite charity. And then we give you a little bonus, more money that goes to both of those charities. The more that you give to the recommended charity, the bigger the bonus goes to both charities. So, but it's all completely up to you. You can give the majority of your donation still to your favorite charity and a little tip to these recommended charities if you like, or you can really lean into these recommendations and really go on those. And then you simply click the button, donate. You can choose to donate monthly or just a one-off. That's how it works. It's really quite straightforward.
Yeah, and the bonus is that coming from another class of donors that's sort of sitting behind the scenes, fueling this, this exercise, the sort of matching idea of trying to encourage extra donations to come in.
Yeah. So we ask people who, if people want to support us, but were already kind of familiar with this idea of expert evaluated charities and trying to think about like how to have the most kind of bang for your buck with your donation, that they might consider, instead of using this main flow, they could become a bonus donor. So they can donate to our bonus fund, which is even simpler. You basically just type in the amount you want to donate and go through like a normal donation process. And then you can, for those bonus donors, that money then sits there. It's definitely going to go to charity or will go to the organizations. But it also is there to then encourage more people to come and use our platform. And it kind of provides, if you like, the fuel that allows our main split and bonus system to work.
Yeah, thank you. Makes sense. Yeah. And you talked about how effective the donations can be, and that sort of equivalence with, how much it would cost. $300 a year is the equivalent of going vegan in terms of the impact on non-human animals. That can be a very compelling way of explaining to people how much we can do with our money if we have some available. Is there a risk in talking about how powerful donations are that it can allow some people to sort of almost do an ethical bypassing in some situations where you can say, well, okay, I'm, for example, going to take the decision to not go vegan, but I can feel better about the harm I'm directly causing because I'm offsetting by making this donation. And from what, a purely mathematical consequentialist approach, you might say, well, that's sort of fair, right? It's better than not doing anything, right? You're having this impact through your donations. You're still having a negative impact through your, not being vegan, but at least you're doing something. So that's better. But at the same time, it's a mindset that we would never accept in an intrahuman ethical conversation, right? We wouldn't say, well, you engage in domestic abuse, but you donate to a local shelter, right? And that offsets. Do you have a worry that it can be an ethical bypassing in some ways? Or do you think it's, once people do start donating, it sort of draws them into an ethical concern with the space that might actually help them make their own personal decisions in a better way too? How do you think about that space?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. The people that we really designed this for, those people, I think there are a lot of people out there who have maybe reduced the amount of animal products they eat because they realize that there are issues around animal agriculture and factory farming with animal cruelty, maybe with the environment as well. Often it's been a both for people, but either because they just don't feel able, or sometimes they literally can't cut out all animal products. Like some people have some incredibly long lists of dietary restrictions that actually genuinely do make this really, really difficult for them, right? This can be a way for people who feel guilty, maybe, about the food they eat, or would like to be doing more, but just don't feel able for whatever reason to at least feel like they are doing something that they can do and are helping in a really meaningful way. And this is not this is not like some sort of, I guess, carbon offset thing where it's kind of like,
it's actually having an impact. Yeah.
Exactly. It's not the same impact as going removing animal products from your diet. It is a meaningful impact on animals. And I think this is a great thing for those people to be able to both do some more good and also manage how they feel about their lives. Because I think it's really important to always remember that, all of us, however much we try, are having negative impacts throughout the way that we go about our lives on the world around us. It's just basically impossible in the modern world not to, right?
I mean, even plant agriculture causes harm and death, right? So yeah,
exactly. And I mean, not to go down that rabbit hole, but like food system is generally really terrible. It's not just the animal agriculture part of it that's a problem.
And I think it's important to, at the same time, not, like you say, not allow that to become an excuse not to make a change. Because as you and I have done, I think that vegan boycott of animal agriculture is still a deeply important and very clear step to take. But it doesn't mean we're suddenly, free of causing any harm and some sort of achieve some level of ethical purity either. So yeah.
Exactly. We've all just got to manage the best we can our impacts on the world, right? And how we can best sharpen and have as much of a positive impact on the world around us as we can. And for some people, that's going to be a lot about, going on protests and working on legal changes and being vegan and doing lots of advocacy. And for many people, that's going to involve donating, and it's going to involve making diet changes and doing these things because they've just got a lot of other things going on in their lives, right?
That's great. Thank you. Well, it's been really useful to understand your sort of big picture view of how we can make these changes and where your end state really wants to aim and how FarmKind fits into that. So yeah, thank you for talking me through it. Is there anything else you wanted to add into the conversation? We've sort of answered what's real, what matters, who matters, and how to make a better world. But if there's anything else you wanted to add in, let me know. But also, how can people follow you, plug into FarmKind, of course? I'll put links in the show notes.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a really interesting conversation. I've really enjoyed it. So thank you. People can find FarmKind via farmkind.giving. Explain exactly what it is on the tin. Right? We're all about donations and helping you to donate to the best organizations. So farmkind.giving. The best place to stay in touch with what we do is to sign up to our newsletter. You should be able to find that quite easily on our website. And then you can see on there, we have the offset calculator that I mentioned that sort of shows you how much money you can donate to based on your diet to have the same amount of positive good as you might be impacting animals in your diet. And also you can very easily on there find out how to use our split and bonus system. It's right on the front page to donate if that's what you'd like to do as well. So yeah, everything is really on the website.
Yeah, thank you. And do you do much social media yourself? For you, if people wanted to follow you personally, or?
So I think LinkedIn is probably the best place. I'm not a typical, like, I'm not a sort of natural social media person, but I am making an effort now because starting a charity has lots of changes to life, and one of them is being forced to use social media more.
Whether you like it or not, yeah. Well, good luck. Good luck. It's still possible to have a good experience out there, but it takes some sometimes brutal curation, and you need to remind yourself you do not have to reply to everybody who's wrong on the internet. So
yeah,
it can be done. It can be done. Well, thank you. It's been a fascinating conversation. I know you're only a month in with FarmKind, but very good luck with the ongoing launch. And it's been great to have you as a guest on Sentientism. Thank you so much, Thom.
thanks a lot. I've really enjoyed it.
Cool. Take care.